Hey class, Kristen here. I'm going to show you how you might use the Photoshop timeline to do this week's assignment, which is the so-called digital flipbook or the experimental flipbook using Photoshop and After Effects. First, I'll pull up Photoshop. On a Mac, I like to hit Command Spacebar and just type in what I'm looking for. If it's installed on your computer, it'll show up. And we're going to make a new file. Let's use the film and video templates here for the purposes of our class. Let's use this one, 1920 by 1080 pixels at 72 dpi or ppi, HDTV 1080p. Let's name this book. Digital flipbook, and all of this is fine. You do want this to be square pixels, pixel aspect ratio. Here is our blank canvas, so to speak. Let's unlock this background layer. You can just click that lock. And then let's bring up the timeline. Now I'm just using the essential layout here. You can try some of these others. You can also save your own customized workspace here. Let's go to timeline and let's create a video timeline. Now, see, it's taken our layer and it's pulled it out to 5 seconds long automatically. Before we start, let's make sure our frame rate is correct. Come to this menu bar, go to Set Timeline Frame Rate, and here's where you can change it to 24 frames per second. For the purposes of this class, we're going to be animating on twos at 24 frames per second. But let's do something a little crazy here. Let's actually change this to 12 frames per second and then convert it to 24 frames per second later on. So animating on ones at 12 frames per second is equivalent to animating on twos at 24 frames per second. So we'll do that conversion later because, again, for the purposes of this class, all of your assignments should be handed in at 24 frames per second. So let's say this is our background layer. Let's use a paintbrush, B for short. Let's pull up the brush window. I'm going to add this, brushes, brush settings, and I'm going to add this. I like accessing it here. Trying to just hover there. Yes. Grab the tab and then let it go there. So let's pick a brush. Let's do some nice charcoal. Here is going to be my background. Now, let's animate a little yellow like swirl coming on. So let's change this to be background, and then I'm going to be adding many layers at once. So let's keep things organized. Let's call this my yellow swirl. Bring this in. Okay. Change this to be yellow. start in the middle here. Okay. So by default, Photoshop is going to make each new layer the duration of 5 seconds long, or however long your timeline is. So then just bring the end of that layer, just trim it down to 1 frame. This is the equivalent of, putting down 1 index card and just making 1 drawing. So we're starting with a little yellow dot. Then I'll put down the next sheet of paper, so to speak. And in order to see what I had previously just done, as if we had a light tracer, let's enable onion skin. And now I can see where I last put that mark. So I'm going to trim this down to 1 frame. Add a new layer. It's like adding a new sheet of paper on top of the light tracer. Eventually, I'd like this to match up with this position here. So I can go to onion skin settings. And I can change this to, maybe 8 frames before. That shows you everything. Or, let's undo that. I will simply duplicate this layer. And then bring it out just as the placeholder so I can match the placement of this, where this swirl is going to end and kind of loop back into itself. Now, because we're animating on ones at 12 frames per second, that means there's going to be 12 drawings in 1 second of footage. So here we have these 12 drawings. They're each trimmed to 1 frame each. That means this represents 1 second of animation right now. So I am going to finish this. And here was my first frame. It'll match right back up. So I'm actually going, I can delete this now. And then let's turn off onion skin. Give this a playback. Nice. So I've just created a looping animation, which means if I copy and paste this over and over again, I'll just have this swirl continuously loop. So let me select, hold down Shift, select, and then drag it all down so I'm duplicating it. And let's just move this over and line it up. And everything is tucked away inside this folder called Yellow Swirl. Same here. All right, so that's happening on a loop. And we can copy and paste it and fill the rest of this time. Now let's try animating a shape. So here's how you can create drawn animation, frame by frame animation in Photoshop by using individual layers as your so-called sheets of paper. And here's your different drawings, and you're trimming them down to the length of the exposure you want them. In other words, we're trimming them down to 1 frame each, animating at 12 frames per second. But Photoshop also has video layers, and those work a little bit differently. Let's say new video group. You'll see the icon is a different shape. If you go up to layer, video layers, new blank video layer. It creates a new layer, and again, it's represented with a different icon. It's got this little video clip on it. These layers don't. In the timeline, these single still image layers are purple, but video layers are blue. So what this means, let's get a new color. Let's do red. This means that it's treating it as if this video layer were a video clip, and you can animate frame by frame on that video clip. So let's maybe add some red flourishes to this little dot here. Let's also turn on onion skin, enable onion skin. So I'm making these markings, and they all exist on this single video layer. So think of the video layer like a film strip where the frames are already there. It's a single strip of footage, and just like the film Blinkety Blank by Norm Maclaren, you're just drawing on each frame, 1 frame at a time. You're drawing on an actual video layer rather than individual still image layers. So this can be helpful if you wanted to maybe rotoscope or trace actual video footage. Let's just turn off onion skin, see what that looks like. All right. So let's say we also wanted to loop this little effect, this little red flourish here. What we would do is just trim this to the very last frame that we drew on, and then we would duplicate this video layer. So I'm going to call this red flourish. Drag this so that I can duplicate it, and it lined it right up on the same video group layer. Let's take a look at using the shape tool to create some elements to animate. So here's the rectangle. We can change the color of it. We can change the color of the stroke around it. change the width of the stroke. What's nice about the shape tool is that you can always go back and change it after you've made it. So I can adjust these corners. And always hit return on your keyboard after you're done adjusting. But now we have this vector element in a bitmap world or a bitmap scene. And, oh, I have to hit return. Then I can scrub through it. Now, if you twirl this down, you get some attributes here that you will be able to add keyframes to. This is what After Effects is just amazing at, but Photoshop also integrates some of these properties to layers. So let us try keyframing the opacity. So turn on the stopwatch to enable keyframe. Little diamond shows up. And let's just have this rectangle disappear and animate it disappearing. So I'm going to come here, change the opacity to 0. And now we've animated opacity on our shape. Likewise, we can let's make a new one. I'm going to drag this and let's just adjust it a little bit. If I wanted to change the proportions, I would hold down Shift and then I can change it however I want. But if I wanted to keep the original proportions, just grab this corner and let's rotate it. Okay, let's save this. And I have to hit return before I come down into the timeline. Let's just drag this out so that this pops on. Okay. Now, instead of animating opacity, let me just turn off that stopwatch and all the keyframes disappear now. Let's animate this style. So turn on the stopwatch. You will enable keyframes. This little diamond will appear. And let's come up to this menu. And let's change it to multiply. And then let's have it go from multiply to maybe let's do vivid light. So now we're animating the style, the layer style. Let's say we want this rectangle to travel. And if I hold down Shift, it will sort of snap. Make sure you hit return before you try touching it in the timeline. Okay. Let's get rid of the style keyframes. I'm going to turn off the stopwatch. That automatically deletes it. Let's keep it on normal. Now let's say we want this rectangle to move. Let's do vector mask position and have it move over here. Now we have this happening. So there's keyframes happening on these shape layers. Now, of course, you can keyframe anything that lets you. But you see that with our still image layers, each image has its own keyframeable attributes, whereas the folder only has this opacity attribute. But video layers let you keyframe the whole layer as one entity, not each individual frame. So I have my red flourish layer here. Let's add position keyframes on that. Let's say it also travels. I'm gonna lock this down so I don't accidentally move it. Make sure you hit enter. Let's just tidy things up a little bit. Let's add this to its own folder. Inside here, we've got these rectangle layers. And then let's just quickly turn the background into a loop as well. I'm going to hold this on 2s and create another one. So I had a white background. And then I'm just going to animate the blue scribble on top. I'll make sure this is the entire duration. And I'll grab my blue color and my brush from before. I'll color that in white. I can use this as a shortcut. Stop that. Command delete will fill in this background color. Option delete will automatically fill in this foreground color. Here's my blue scribble. I'll cycle that. So I'll make a third one. As soon as you drag these layers onto the same layer, it actually turns them into a video group. So that's something else that you could do. Okay, so say we're done drawing and creating animation in Photoshop. Now let's export this. Okay, let's make sure we're saving to our hard drive, to our assignment folder, and then let's also make sure our work area is set to the very end, and we're not going to be exporting any black frames. So let's just do 5 seconds. There we go. Save that again, Command S. So here's our work area, trimmed down to 5 seconds long, 12 frames per second, right? Now let's export this at 24 frames per second. Menu in the timeline, render video. Let's keep the naming convention for class. This is going to be version 1 of the flipbook. And let's export this at H.264 instead of a QuickTime. Make sure this is saving to your hard drive and the right folder for this assignment. We're going to export at H.264, which will create an MP4 file, as opposed to a QuickTime file, which would create an MOV file. So this is just so you get some practice exporting at different formats. Again, most of the time for class, you will be exporting QuickTime files. But for this one, let's export an MP4 file. Let's change the frame rate now to 24 frames per second. And you'll see when we export this, let's make sure everything is right. So 1920 by 1080, yes, we want to keep the document size. High quality, sure. Work area, yes, because we set that. Now let's render it. Now you'll see that during the rendering process, it will do the math. It will take our animation on ones at 12 frames per second, and it will convert it to twos. It will convert the same animation, but play it at 24 frames per second, which essentially is what we might think of as animating on twos. So if you open the file, and let's also make sure we save this PSD before we leave. Here we have it. 5 seconds long. If I step through this frame by frame, you can see every drawing that I did in Photoshop is now being held for 2 frames. That's because if we look at Command I, you'll see that it's been converted to 24 frames per second, which means each of our drawings, when we did 12 drawings per second, each drawing is now held for 2 frames at 24 frames per second.